All right, so I've got my DAW pulled up that you can check out the video, and you can listen along. If you're listening, you're not like, "Oh, sad Charlie Brown, I got a rock." No, you'll be able to get something out of this. But I do have a DAW pulled up. I am in Logic Pro, and we're going to talk about a couple of different things. The first thing I want to talk about is a recap on the different types of drum programming plugins. But even before then, I want to make sure that there's a real understanding of when we talk about programmed drums versus recorded drums. Now, recorded drums should make sense. You sit down and you play drum set, somebody records it and puts it into a DAW as an audio wave form. So they're actually recording your performance of that. So that is recorded audio. Programmed audio, or MIDI relies on virtual instruments. And so when I talk about a drum plugin, what I'm talking about is a module, like a drum kit module, that has a virtual representation of the different aspects of the drum set. Different parts, things like the kick drum, toms, snare drum, hi-hat, crash cymbal, ride cymbal. And we can use MIDI data, MIDI information, MIDI notes to send signals to play the kick or the toms or the snare drum. Think of it this way. Think of it like a 20th century player piano, where the MIDI notes are kind of cooking along, and instead of triggering a hammer on a piano string, it's actually triggering a virtual instrument. And so programmed drums rely on virtual instruments as opposed to recorded audio. So when we say things like samples, what we're talking about is a recording of a snare drum. When we talk about a sample of a kick, these are our recordings of kick drums or toms or crash cymbals, ride cymbals with different articulations that go along with it. So that's what we mean by MIDI versus recorded audio. And I'm actually going to create an 8-bar phrase here for us so that we can really see the MIDI working. But we're relying on virtual instruments that trigger different drum samples. And it's not unlike an electronic drum kit. When you sit down to play an electronic drum kit, when you hit the snare drum, what you're doing is you are using the electronic pad or V-kit or whatever to call back or to trigger a recording of a snare drum or a clap or whatever you have triggered. That's essentially what's happening. But with programmed drums, instead of a human being hitting a pad, it's the computer telling the virtual instrument using a MIDI note. Does that make sense, Troy?
Absolutely.
Cool. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at programmed drums versus recorded drums. And we talked about 4 major plugins, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them today. But last week we talked about Logic Pro's stock drum kit and their drum kit designer. We also talked about Native Instruments Studio Drummer, and those are the 2 that I'm going to show today. And then we talked about a Superior Drummer and BFD. These are some of the other big ones. We have links to those in our show notes. And I have an instance of Logic's stock drummer and the drum kit designer that they have here. And what I love about this is you not only get a visual representation of the drums, but you can go in and you can change. Let's say I don't like this kick sound, so I can switch to a different kick. So I can switch those out. Let's say this snare drum. All right, I like that snare drum a little bit better. The crash cymbals, the right crashes. Oh, it's a little low in pitch. Let's tune it up a little bit. There it is. Let's say the ride cymbal. The ride cymbal's a little too ringy. Let's dampen it a little bit. It makes it a little bit drier. And they have presets that you can load. This is the Bluebird kit. You can load in another kit called the Brooklyn kit, which Has different toms. There's a Detroit garage kit.
Now these names are all kind of modeled after the idea of like a Motown type style kit or a jazz kit.
Exactly.
I'm assuming.
As a matter of fact, if you're watching the video, each of these kits have kind of a knockoff logo to them, and so like this one, it's kind of a Ludwig type kit. There's one here that looks very much like a Gretsch kit, and it says the word Logic, but it looks like a knockoff Gretsch logo. Let's see. Well, that's the Gretsch one again. This one looks like an old Slingerland kit. There's the Ludwig one again. Here's one that looks like a DW. And if you're watching the video, you can see it says Drums Logic, but it looks like a knockoff Drum Workshop logo. And so you can kind of piece together. Here's one that's an acrylic kit, clearly a Ludwig acrylic. Let's see. I'm just looking through these. Here's one that also looks like a Slingerland. Here's one that looks like a Yamaha. It's got like a little star and a circle instead of the Yamaha logo. And let's see, that's still Yamaha. There's a Tama one too that I'm trying to find, but I can't find that one. So when we're dealing with a drum kit module, let me just load up one. Let's load up. Trying to find one that's okay. Here's a good one. This is the acrylic one, and you can load in different snare drums, and you can tune them. You can pitch them up and down. And all I'm doing, I'm just hitting a MIDI keyboard right now.
What kind of MIDI keyboard are you using?
I'm using a Novation Launch Key 61 because it has pads on it, which I'm not too hung up on using the pads. Hang on one second. It did not like what I just did. Give me one second. MIDI keyboard right now.
What kind of MIDI keyboard are you using?
I'm using a Novation Launch Key 61 because it has pads on it, which I'm not too hung up on using the pads. So I don't use the pads very much. I do have a pad module called the Akai MPD18. And Troy, if you wouldn't mind just jotting that in the show notes, just MPD18, I'll make sure the links get there properly.
Done.
And it is based off of the Akai MPC, and it's the same pad layout. But I use a keyboard most of the time. So with these modules, I can affect the tuning, the dampening, how loud they are, or I can switch out snare drums altogether. The dampening, how loud they are, switch the drums altogether. And the cool thing about it, remember I mentioned previously how these are hypersampled or multi-sampled depending on what marketing slang and marketing jargon is being used at the time. And when on the claps is where you can really hear it. Not only the multi-sampled, meaning the harder you hit it, it fires up a different sample, but also the round robin. And check this out. I'm going to hit the clap lightly, and then I'm going to increase the velocity, meaning how hard I'm going to hit it. And then you'll hear the different samples or the different individual recordings of hand claps being fired. Check it out. So this is low velocity. Can you hear the different recordings? It's not just the same recording over and over. And the same is true on the snare drum. We have that articulation. We also have a rim shot. So you can create really, and then get into the kick. And so forth. So I was just kicking onto the hi-hat. So this is Logic's drum kit, and they also have the drum kit designer. and which I really, really like. Actually, before I get into that, let me go into these producer kits. And here's what I love about Logic's producer kits. If I wanted kick, snare, and hat on different tracks, then I would have to have 3 different instances. However, with producer kit, meaning 3 different instances on 3 different tracks, and I would label one kick, snare, hat. But with producer kits, I could bring in a drum set, and it will create a multi-auxed patch, meaning that it's created outputs for each of the elements of the drum kit that I can go in and edit and manipulate and EQ and add effects and pretty much anything I want to on top of it without having to do individual tracks for each one. It's very, very handy and very, very helpful. And let me record something real quick. I'm just gonna record a nice simple groove. Let's put this at like 90. Let's make sure that my click.
When you say 90, what do you mean by putting?
Sorry, 90 beats per minute.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Yep. And so let me just record something. Here we go. This is a little quick 8-bar loop. I'm going to go ahead and set my loop region here. And before I get, let's clean up this performance just a little bit. I'm going to open up my piano roll. I'm going to close the library and open up my piano roll. Oops. And my piano roll gives me a view of the notes that I just played in a MIDI window. And this is MIDI data. Let me turn off this click. Actually, let me just do beats. Boop. Turn off the click. All right. Now, my performance wasn't perfect because A, I'm human, and B, I'm playing drum grooves with my fingers. Right.
Now, are you inputting the are you activating the instruments via keys or pads?
With keys right now. So I have my I have a key on the keyboard. It's actually the note C is a kick, the D is the snare, the F sharp is the closed hi-hat, and the A sharp or B flat is the open hi-hat. And I have toms, I have crash cymbals, ride cymbals, cross stick, everything else. So this is MIDI data. So this one note here hitting that is the kick. This is sending a signal to the drum module, to the virtual instrument, to play the kick sound at this velocity. Note that the note is red. That means it's a nice heavy velocity. If I click the note, you'll see I have a velocity meter over here, and I can tell that it is at 123. When I click on my hi-hat, I'm at 125, but notice the next hi-hat note is at 54. This gives me that shoulder tip sound and is much more realistic. And these are the things that people who don't play drums have a hard time kind of getting their brain around, because they wouldn't know that hi-hat parts sound weird if you just clock them all at the same velocity. This sounds fake. But we know that if you want to play a convincing drum part and want to add some quarter note pulse into the part, then you end up with velocities which look like what we have here, which are that accent on the downbeat, and then it's less accented on the upbeats. So what I can do here, let me stretch that out just a little bit, is the performance wasn't all that great, and so I want to quantize it. And what quantizing means is it moves the MIDI notes to the closest on-beat grid, depending on if you want a 16th note quantization, which means that it's going to push your MIDI notes to the closest 16th note. I can make it eighth notes, which would push it to the closest eighth note. For me, I want 16th note quantization, so I select it all there, hit Q, and now I get this performance. Now compare it to the non-quantized version. Compared to the quantized. But Dave, that sounds too mechanical. What can you do? Well, I could adjust the strength of the quantization, like 0. Let me select all there. 0 strength would apply no quantization. I can apply like 75% quantization, so it would retain 25% of my performance. I can also apply a little bit of swing to it. So if I wanted it to be swung a little bit, but it's all of these little velocity changes.
I just have one quick question.
Yes, sir.
If let's say you're playing along and you're doing a great job, and then you fudge a fill, can you focus the quantization on say a couple of bars?
Absolutely. Or you can just select the MIDI notes that you want to quantize. This was me just dragging them, and I want to quantize those. Yep, absolutely. Okay. Speaking of fudging fills, you notice here I have my offbeat, my open hi-hat happening at the end of every 2 bars. But I biffed it at the end of my 6th bar. No worries. All I got to do is change this hi-hat note here, move it to the open hi-hat, I had the open hi-hat incorrectly at the end of the 7th bar, and now everything should be in place. Let me zoom in a little bit to make sure that. And now we listen to it. Let's quantize it. Let's say, hey, I really want a crash cymbal on the downbeat. I'm going to take my hi-hat on the downbeat of the bar and put it onto a crash cymbal. I don't like that hi-hat sound, or that crash cymbal. Let's go to a different crash. I have a crash up here. Here's an instance where I hit the kick drum at the same time. Just I call them fat finger moments, and I don't want that note, so I'm going to just delete it out. And there you have your drum pattern. And here's what is so cool about using these producer kits is I have that is a MIDI region. I have an 8-bar MIDI region that by itself produces no sounds, but each one of these MIDI notes, I'm just arrowing through here. These all trigger the virtual instrument, just like you would if you were sitting at a Roland V kit. With the producer kits, if I open up the window here, I have access to a bunch of different microphone placements, and let me solo these out. So this is what the overhead mics sound like. Turn it up a little bit. All right, so that's the overhead mics. Here is just the kick drum. This is right at the this is batter side. Here's the front side, the reso side. Here's the top snare drum microphone, the bottom snare drum microphone, the hi-hat mic.
Now, all of these features that you're showing here, if you purchase Logic Pro, just stock Logic Pro,
for $200,
everything that you're doing can be done in stock Logic Pro. You don't have any extra paid for plugins activated right now, or
this is all stock. Yep,
all stock. Okay,
this is all stock. I have different tom mics. I have different room mics. So there's room. This is a different room mic depending on if I've gone to it. Here's a leak mic. I like the leak mic. This is a mic that's like leaking through the door outside. I also have different tambourine mics, clap mics, and everything else. And so the producer kit loads all of these in dynamically. And so I could go in and let's say that I wanted more bottom end of the snare sound, but less top. So I could roll out the top snare. Let's say I want more of the room sound. I can go in, give more room sound. Let's say I want less of the leak. Let's say the hi-hat's a little bit too loud. I can mix it that way. I want more of the overheads to give different vibes to it. Now, let's say I want to change drum sets altogether. Let's say I want something that sounds like a Motown kit. I just switch kits, and because they all share the same MIDI routing, then I just hit play. Let's say I want more sound, more like a old school vintage drum breaks.
Nice.
Let's say I want it to sound like a Beatles kit. Let's say I want it to sound like a Nine Inch Nails record. Let's say I want it to sound like a jungle. Let's see what this sounds like.
Wow, that sounds like my little Sonar Jungle kit. Like they got that down. Wow.
Here's another. This is an R&B kit. And here's what I really love about the producer kits is if I go into the producer kit, now not only do I have access to the drums that were available to us originally, but I have access to every single kick sound. So I have a birch with a punchy birch, a boomy maple, a punchy maple. This one's called Pawn Shop. So this is like an old beat up loose punch. This is acrylic punch, or acrylic felt, acrylic punch, 60s kit. So this is like a Ringo kit, an old Ludwig deep felt. This is the Stadium. This is the Tama one. You can see the Tama knockoff logo. This is like a Yamaha, and this is going to be a DW. And I can pull up the different toms, and so you can essentially craft. You can have I can have Tama drums. I can have Tama drums on top of a DW kick with a Black Beauty snare drum, or a heavy brass snare drum, or a steel snare drum, or a chrome snare drum, or a soprano maple snare drum, or a vintage maple snare drum, or a vintage plywood. And I can go into this plywood and adjust the tuning. Open up the hi-hats. Let's say I want like some A custom type sounds. Let's say I want just regular A. Let's say I want like K's. Let's say I want some old school vintage sounds. Now, let's say I don't want that ride cymbal at all. I want that to be on, or I don't want that hi-hat at all. I want that to be on a ride cymbal. Well, I can take those notes and just Move them up to the ride cymbal. And instead of an open hi-hat, I want it to go on the bell. And all I'm doing is I'm just moving MIDI notes. Okay, now what would happen if I want that performance to be faster? So I'm just going to switch it up to 120 beats per minute. Oh, that sounds stupid. Let's go 105. So there are so many different options available to you.
This is kind of where you go crazy, right? Because you sit there, you're making a track, and you're like, you're constantly just fine-tuning.
And the performance is putting your hands on a keyboard, or I mean, you could if you wanted to. You can like bust out the pencil tool and draw notes in. That's not my style. That takes more work. I believe that's just not worth it. Putting your hands on a MIDI keyboard, or getting a drum pad, or a lot of folks bring in like a V kit or an electronic kit, and they'll actually play in their parts that way. They will play in their drum patterns on an electronic kit. For me, I'm totally comfortable on a keyboard or on a set of drum pads or something like that. Totally fine with me. But there are some things that you need to keep in mind, and these are the things that as drummers we need to keep in mind. First of all is the velocity and working with velocities. And what makes this pattern believable is the fact that it's not all the exact same velocity. Let me play this groove for you, and let me go back to a different kit. Let me go back to the producer kits. Let's go to the Bluebird kit. I'm going to move this ride cymbal back down to the hi-hat and move my bells back to the open hi-hats. Let me show you what this would sound like if these were all the same velocities.
That's all the same velocity?
That's all the same velocity. That's all max 127. I could change it all to...
Doesn't sound terrible.
No, it doesn't sound horrible. But check out the difference between this and this. This is max velocity. This is with velocities. There's a little note that's not speaking. So this is a perfect example. I'm like, this little note right here, it's too soft. So I'm going to go in, and I'm going to raise the velocity of that guy. I'm going to go back in time and tell my drummer to hit it a little bit harder. All right, and here is all the same velocity. With multiple velocities, same velocities, multiple velocities, same velocities. Yeah, listen to that. Listen to that fill with multiple velocities. Right, it adds into this actually not too many variables. I think they're both at 127. Let me pull down that first one a little bit. So working with your velocities, making sure that as you program your MIDI data, that you capture some of the elements of your performance, and making sure that it's not all the same velocities. Otherwise, it's going to sound too much like just gunfire. As a matter of fact, let me do up a gunfire example for you here. I'm just gonna go check it. chord. Whoops, I put it on the wrong. Put it on the wrong region. Just a 1 bar, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1. Let's quantize it. Let me give you a downbeat too. Let me make it all the same velocity. Now you can hear the round robin kicking in. Hear how it's not the exact same sound every single time.
Yeah.
So that helps. But compare it. Which one sounds more like it was performed by a human? Right? That first one, hopefully. Now, and I can go in and craft accent patterns. So I can go in and let's say I want dot, dot, dot. So I'm just adjusting some velocities here. I'm just trimming down these velocities. Let's say I want it to crescendo there at the end. Now I want that last one to be a rim shot. Let's say I want my accents to be rim shots. I want this note to be a rim shot. So you can see the complete flexibility that you have working with your parts here. Not having adequate velocity editing is one of the key problems that I see students have whenever they program drums. They just put them all at the same velocity and they sound really artificial.
Gotcha.
Were you gonna say something?
No, that was kind of it. What do you find is sort of the biggest problem for beginners, or what is sort of the biggest hurdle that sometimes you have to climb to learn this stuff?
Yeah, and it's working with velocities, and a lot of times that comes from not inputting with like an instrument, like not putting your hands on keys or pads or something. Because I didn't work really hard to create all of the velocities that you're seeing here. Those were all created because I keyed them in on a keyboard. And so it maintains all of the different velocity variations. The other thing that I see students really messing up on, and things that make them sound fake, is not thinking in larger phrases. Because as drummers, when we sit down and play, we don't think we play 1 bar and then just play 1 bar over and over. And sadly, that's what a lot of people do. A lot of drum programmers that aren't drummers program drum patterns like this. I'm going to quantize that and then loop it. Actually, there's way too many velocity variations there, so let me flatten that out. It's just the same loop over and over and over and over and over. I've grown tired of this kit. I want a different kit. I've grown bored. Let's put the Brooklyn kit in. But that's not how we as drummers think, is it?
No.
No, we think in larger phrases. So when you're programming drum parts on your own, be thinking of larger 2, 4, 8 bar phrases. And here's how I actually, when I program drums, I think exactly like this. I think by starting out with a 1 bar motive. And then I repeat that motive, but I add a little something something at the end. In that case was the open hi-hat. So let me record my 1 bar motive. So there's my 1 bar motive. I'm going to quantize it. Make sure that merging there. All right, so now I'm going to add my 2nd bar, which is going to be the restatement of the motive, but with a little something, little open hi-hat here. I had a little fat finger moment. I'm going to join these together, and I need to make sure that the hi-hat keeps going. So now I have a 2 bar idea starting from a 1 bar motive. 1 bar, 2nd bar. There's my secondary rhythm idea. Now I'm going to repeat the motive again in the 3rd bar of my phrase. And I'm hitting record and it's backing up 1 bar. That's why you're hearing a bar. Let me join those. It's not. Make sure I've got the same thing. One quick second, guys. All right, so now I have a 3 bar idea starting with a 1 bar motive. Restate with a little something. Now I'm going to restate again, but add a little bit extra something something. This is bar 4. You with me?
Dude, I'm locked in.
So now I have a 4 bar idea starting with a 1 bar motive. 1, little something something, motive, little something else. I want to add bat bat boom. Let's move that there. Bat, boom boom. All right. Now I'm going to restate my motive again. Now I'm quantizing all along the way, and now I'm going to restate the motive with a little something something that I had in the earlier bar. And then finally, I don't want those downbeats there. And finally, I'm in my 8th bar. I'm going to bring it home, sprinkle in some toms, and that's it for me. This is my 8th bar. Here we go. Select all here. Oops. What you doing? Quantize it. And now, using a 1 bar motive, boom, boom, blat, boom, boom, I have created an 8 bar complete phrase. Whoops. Oh, my bad. 1 bar short, 1 bar short. That's a 7 bar phrase. I need to restate the motive and then add the fill. So let me do that now. I'm going to restate the motives. This is bar 7 and then 8. Switch it up just a little bit. Also, I had a little fat finger moment. See that note right there? The kick was a little bit too soft, so I'm going to bring it up. And now when it loops, it should loop nice and steadily. And let's put a crash on the downbeat, shall we? So I'm going to move this note up to the crash. And so I've taken a 1-bar motive and crafted an 8-bar phrase. So it's only really the composition aspect of it, the creative aspect is only 1 bar long. The rest is crafting. And this is exactly how whenever I write my tracks for the NFL or whatever, this is exactly how I put them together. Where people get into trouble is when they only think in 1 bar and they just loop that bar. Yes, sir.
Now, can you talk a little bit about maybe how you've got your interface set up? Because I assume you've probably done a little bit of customizability. Maybe you've put some menus together, or maybe you've customized things in your interface for a certain reason or way.
It's pretty stock. It's pretty stock. In Logic, you can open up different views. And in the view that you're seeing right now is piano roll in the bottom with the MIDI region here and my instrument that I can open up, and then I can mix accordingly, the kick in and the overhead sounds and all that. So it's pretty stock. I really don't do a ton of customization. I just have a Novation Launch Key 61 running to my computer via USB, and that's really
all she wrote, huh?
That's all she wrote, man. That's really all there is to it there.
Now, what about bringing in something like BFD into the mix or Superior Drummer?
I'm glad you asked. And I don't have those plugins, but I do want to bring in Studio Drummer from Native Instruments. So I'm going to create a new instrument here, and I'm going to go into my Native Instruments. It's in the contact library. That brings open this really big contact window. And the view is a little big right now because I have the screen zoomed in so you can see it, but you can still see where I'm getting to.
Now, Superior Drummer is a separate, just for listeners that don't know, Superior Drummer is a separate purchase from Logic Pro.
Correct. And so here is a session kit full, and it looks like this. It's going to let me do this. Give me 1 second. It's not liking that. All right, let me change the resolution. I don't know what that's going to do mid-video, but let's find out. Actually, let me pause the video and then I come back because I don't want to screw up the video. Hang on 1 second. All right, so we're back, and I've had to bump up my screen resolution so the whole thing can fit on the screen here. But this is Studio Drummer by Native Instruments, also the same people that make Tractor, also make Complete and Complete Ultimate. Studio Drummer is included in Complete Ultimate, and you can see a lot of the same types of components that we have with the Logic Pro drum kit and the drum kit designer. You could go in, you can change the cymbals, you can change in the different types of hi-hats. It's a little bit more locked in. It's not quite as flexible, but you do have the option. I'm going to copy this region onto my my second instrument. Let's see what we got. And I can change different mixers. This is like a jazz mix. It's like a hard rock mix. It's like a metal mix. It's a blues and country mix. Like a blues rock, ballad, indie rock, like a disco mix. And these are just basically different EQ settings. There's funk, and you can dial up different drum kits. So let's bring in a garage kit. So that is just the studio kit. It's very very much like a DW kit or something like that, maybe a Yamaha. So I'm loading up. This is the garage kit. Here's a stadium kit, which I've used, which is just huge. Now you can open up the mixer here and you can dial in, like let's say I want less kick, less snare. You also have overhead. So that's like the overhead mic. You have the room mic. You have a different overhead mic. So there's the kick mic, the snare mic, hi-hat mic. You have tambourine and cowbell mics, and you have EQs across all of these, as well as transients and compressors and a bunch of other stuff I don't necessarily want to get into. But you can dial in the kick, dial in each of these sounds. Like if I wanted a slower attack on my kick versus a nice tight. Let's say if I want a slower attack on my snare versus that. Let's say I want more snare in the overhead, less snare in the overhead, but more snare in the room. I want to pitch it up a little bit. I can load in different snares. You don't have as many options as you do, but I find the Studio Drummer to have more a deeper multi-sample.
Gotcha.
Especially that sounds really, really good. I'm just playing the snare drum on a keyboard. Also, with Complete, you get the Abbey Road's 60s drummer, which is very much like a Beatles kit, and it has a cool throwback vibe to it, and it sounds like this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, with all of the work, the professional work that you're doing basically everything in Logic and Superior Drummer, is that correct?
Logic or Studio Drummer. Superior Drummer is different. Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep. All of my professional work are these two plugins.
Okay.
So there's the early 60s. So I do a lot of cool jazz stuff on this. Here's the late 60s. It's loading in the samples now. Let me go to a different mix here. Let's go to rock and roll. This is blues rock. Love the jazz rock. The early with jazz, the jazz mixer gives you a really cool vintage type sound. Especially if you wanted to do like a drum break. Let's see if I can pull one of those off. Let's see what tempo is that. Let's see what happens. You do something like that.
That was great, man.
Let's quantize it. Turn off the click. Let's speed it up a little bit more. Let's swing it just a little bit. I'm missing a kick note. Right there. No, I don't like that. Let's do a dot ba dot there at the end. Now loop just that. No, I don't like that note at all. Oh, I'm missing a snare drum note. Let's make it a double kick. Punch the second one. There we go. Now we start to sound like the amen break. Let's throw in a little open hi-hat here. Right there. now you got a drum break. And it's really that easy to
And
put
that was a minute. That was like a minute or 2 minutes.
of programming. Yep. And then I would go in and maybe I want to throw in some let's throw in a little bit of distortion, because those things would have probably at the time would have peaked the mic. And then if you really want to get funky, let's do. Let's see what happens. Throwing some bass in there, man.
Is that you playing the bass? Or
Yeah,
is that...
that was me. Yep. Before you know it, you got yourself a little cool track. Good times, man. A lot of fun.
That's pretty well it, huh?
Yeah, and so talking about phrasing, the two things I really wanted to make sure that you walked away with today, if you're listening to this or watching this and not watching me just play around in my DAW, which sounds bad, but you know what I mean.
But I think like, number one, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just listening to this, please go watch the video, because that's really where all the the visual information is, of course, but where the learning is. But I think what's really important for drummers to understand is it sounds really good. There's jobs to be had out there. This is a new area. If you've never done this before, that you could pick up. I mean, how long would you say before you had a pretty good handle on Logic? I know you've been with Logic for quite a long time, but how long before you kind of knew your way around the system?
It probably took me again. I brought like reason and reason and Ableton knowledge to the table. So some of what my learning curve was unlearning what I the quick keys and everything else, like learning Finale and then learning Sibelius. Part of learning that is unlearning what you already know.
Yeah.
So part of it was that. It was probably a good 3 to 6 months before I felt like, wow, I was like kind of bopping around. But it was 3 to 6 months from when the DAW kind of got in my way. Like when you hear me doing what I'm doing, I know where all the quick keys are. I know what I want it to be able to do. I know how to quantize. I know, hey, I need to throw some overdrive on it, and those kind of things to make it sound like the way I want it to sound. If you're coming from absolutely nowhere, then it may be 2 months, 1 to 2 months, and that like real study. And there are a lot of tutorials out there. If you're really serious about learning this, spend a few bucks, get a month's subscription to Lynda. And lynda.com, they have entire courses, or Mac Pro videos. They have entire courses which will walk you through Logic's interface, Logic's workflow, as well as Pro Tools and Ableton Live. They're not just Logic centric. But just buy a month subscription to that, and it will absolutely let you hit the ground running. And it starts from zero. Like, this is how you open the program. Here's how you set up. Here's how you set up your audio routing, and here's how you set up your MIDI parameters. I mean, it really does start from ground zero.
Now, when you have students at Full Sail, I'm assuming you probably get students that have never touched this system.
Correct.
And then of course, you're teaching a course, so they've got to get proficient in a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find it's pretty easy? Are they able to grasp the concepts pretty quickly?
Absolutely. Especially students that really pour themselves into it, and I have a lot of respect for online students, because they're trying to balance school in between the cracks of their everyday commitments, such as family and jobs and everything. So if you're an online student and making it work and making Dean's List and all that stuff, mad propers, because that's not easy to do. But the students that really pour themselves into it, absolutely. As a matter of fact, what I taught you about phrasing, that is one of my lectures at Full Sail. about start with one bar motive and repeat it, and secondary rhythms and crafting 8-bar phrases and all of that. That's absolutely taken straight out of my my lectures at Full Sail. It's what I teach there. I teach about working with velocities, crafting convincing drum patterns, and using velocities and using 8-bar phrases. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the octo drummer, meaning the idea of a drummer with 8 arms. And this is another thing that makes drums sound fake and programmed drums. So here, let's start with my my little break beat here. Pull that velocity a little bit. And so that sounds really cool. But where we start getting fake is if I'm programming this, or if I'm sitting and playing on the drums, here both of my hands are occupied. I'm just looping this last bar. Both of my hands are occupied. My right hand's on my hi-hat, my left hand's on the snare if you're right-handed. Where it starts sounding weird is when you see programmers going in and start plugging in and adding. Let me throw on another drum fill. And so they'll throw on a little fill like this. And they might also throw on something like this. And it just starts becoming too much. And this gets into a little bit of the uncanny valley thing that we talked about last week. We only have a right hand and a left hand and a right foot and a left foot. So generally, I like to keep it. So if I'm playing the toms, then my one of the hands has to free up. So I might pull one hand off of the hi-hat, and you get this. Pull that snare drum off. And I might edit the pattern this way. And I might take that note off there. Let's pull these off here. And you don't lose a lot. The energy of this little fill that I made is still there, but it would actually be playable by a human being. Let's listen to 2 bars of it. The only thing that's a little trippy is having this tom hit and the snare at the same time. And so I would sacrifice the tom hit because that would be really difficult to try to pull off. So I have a fill which sounds like. So those are the notes. Let me slow it down so you really, really hear it. Take just the last bar. Right? So it makes sense as a performer. Let me try to like undo all the notes and play it that slow, and you'll see kind of how fake it sounds at that slow tempo. Hear how it's just like, it's just too.
One way I can visualize myself playing it, the other way I can't.
Right, exactly. So let's remove. It's the hi-hat stuff that tends to get in our way more than anything else. Let's remove that note. So we have move that right hand. Move these offending hi-hat notes out of the way. And that's a cool sounding fill. Let's listen to it at tempo in context. I mean, it's a little busy for this thing, but that's not really the point.
Sure, but I mean, it's more about what's believable from a from a human element or a human aspect. Is that believable,
Right.
regardless of the taste of, or your taste or choices?
Exactly. Now back to Pacemaker's question, and he said, "Could you make a complex track sounding convincingly realistic if you imagine them being played by two separate drummers, like the Grateful Dead?" And I say yes, as long as you are using two different instances of two different kits, and then you could use some panning, some creative panning, and put one maybe in the left and one in the right. But where it sounds fake is when you have the same drum sound playing those same instruments. Because if you have the two drummers like in the Allman Brothers, then they're playing they're individual people, so their performance is going to be subtly different, as well as their drum sounds. They're not physically playing the same drum kit at the same time. So I would pull up different drums, tune them up a little bit differently in your virtual instrument, and then use some creative placement in the stereo field, left and right. And then I think you could get away with some of those. But what we can't do, and what we shouldn't do as drummers, if you're listening to this and you are wanting to get into programming, then you need to think of fills and components like this like a drummer would do. You have a finite number of limbs that you can hit stuff with. So don't just go ballistic. Just because you can program an 8-arm drummer doesn't mean you should.
The listener only has so much bandwidth. So if you are filling up all of the rhythmic space or all of the rhythmic subdivisions, it's just not going to sound good, because that's not the listener becomes overloaded. Now, there are times, yes, where I'm listening to some fusion tracks or something like that, and I'm really, really enjoying it, but I can only handle it for so long because your brain just becomes completely overloaded, and then you start wanting space.
That's right.
So,
Right. So those are my thoughts for you, and hopefully you found that very helpful. If there are if there is more of this topic that you want to hear about, please let us know. We are not beyond doing a third part of this show or going even further into this. If there's something you want, I mean, we could talk about mixing and how do you mix, program drums. We talked a little today about quantization, about phrasing, about using velocities. But if there are other topics in this area that you want to know about, please let us know, because I love talking about it. I could talk about it for hours and hours, as was evidenced by last week. Troy's trying to get me off the air, and I had class about to start, and he's like, "Hey, buddy," and my clock is 20 minutes slow for reasons beyond what I want to talk about right now. So yeah, hopefully you found that very helpful.